Now we come to somewhat of a crescendo in Aristotle's teaching about the good life, and that is the subject of the virtue of justice. Why is this the crescendo? Because Aristotle believes this is the most important and essential virtue for we as humans. Well, think about it. For Aristotle, human beings are not creatures that live alone. They live in society, and therefore they need each other. They're what he calls social or political animals. As a result, the one virtue that deals not only with our own individual talents or individual excellencies, but with the way we relate with others is justice. Justice is the only relational virtue. To see this, just think about being stranded on a desert island, like that movie Lost with Tom Hanks. Could we call someone who is on this desert island and has no one else to relate to but themselves just? It doesn't seem to make sense. You can't say they're fair or just, because being fair or just involves what you do with other people. You might call them courageous because they have to face a lot of fears and face them in the right way. And you might even call them temperate or self-controlled because they still have to deal with their own desires for pleasure and moderate those. So Tom Hanks, while he's on the desert island, could be a temperate and a courageous person. But unless he's in society and among other people, there's no way that we could properly call what he does and the way he comports himself in his lifestyle there as just. So justice is the most important virtue because it's the one virtue which is directed toward the good of others and not just the good of oneself. So now, what is justice? Aristotle feels that this is a very ambiguous term in the Greek, just as it is in English. But this ambiguity is something that we can still see a commonality. To say that something at word is ambiguous is to say that it has two or more closely related senses. In all of these senses, Aristotle says there's one thing in common. Justice is about a certain drive that humans have, and that is the drive for personal advantage. All of us want the goods in life. We want money, we want fame, we want to be loved, we want material possessions, we might say bling. We want honor, we want power over our lives and maybe even other people. And so all of these things are naturally we are drawn to. We're drawn to seeking after the things that are to our advantage. Aristotle says these are the goods of fortune because these are not things that simply we're born with. We have to be in certain circumstances to achieve them, and often we have no control over what we originally have because we might be born in a certain strata of society or with a certain family and a certain socioeconomic background. And so, thus, this natural drive needs to be controlled because we could take advantage of others, and when we do, we're unjust. When we take advantage of others by what? By taking more advantages than we deserve. Or we could, in the opposite sense, be taken advantage of, and that would be bad too when we take less than the advantages, fewer advantages than we deserve. So for Aristotle, not only is the person who takes more than they deserve unjust, but also the person who doesn't take what they deserve, who allows themselves to be taken advantage of. That person has the deficiency of this. They don't have enough of a drive to take and to give what they deserve. Or to put it in the sense of giving, you might give more than a person deserves, or you might give them less than they deserve. And so thus the happy medium is to give all and only what people deserve, including yourself and what you take. So even though the just person is the one who only takes the goods and gives the goods that are deserved, there's still this ambiguity. And we see this in the Greek word itself. When we call a person just, we call them dikaios in the Greek. A just person, a dikaios person, is someone who you could think of in two senses, in a universal sense and in a particular sense. So the universal sense is the sense of just someone who does the right thing. So dikaiosune, righteousness, is one translation of it. Just a good person, a person who does the right thing by other people. And you can see how that's a very general term and doesn't necessarily have just to do with goods or advantages, but definitely someone who's like this is going to be someone who gives to people and takes only and all what they deserve. So the person who has this kind of sense of justice is going to be the second kind of person, the particular kind. And that's the notion of fairness. So thus, dikaios could mean someone who's just a righteous person, but could also mean, more particularly and more narrowly, someone who is fair. Now, the word for fair is the word isos, and isos is a very interesting word because it literally means equal, as in two triangles that are equal, or with two sides, are isosceles triangles when they have the two sides that are equal. And so the better translation of this is an equitable person, and Aristotle realizes this. So one of the big questions we're going to delve into in the second lecture on this topic is the question of the relationship between being a fair or just person and treating people equally. There has to be some sense that the fair person is someone who treats people equally, who's not partial. And that's why we often have justice blindfolded in our statues of her. The idea is that justice is no respecter of persons, but is impersonal in its application and therefore equal. But that's not an easy way. There's no easy relationship here because some people deserve more than others. And so we have to talk about how some persons could deserve more than others, but yet when we treat both people, we treat them equally. We treat them in an equitable manner. So now let's go back to this sense, because this is the first sense that Aristotle wants to parse out. In what sense, when we say that someone does the right thing, are they a just person? He says that kind of person is a lawful person. That's what your translation says. And then it makes it appear as if what he's saying is every law is a good law, and the person who abides by the law, the legalities, is therefore a just or a righteous person. And Aristotle certainly doesn't mean this. He realizes there are good and bad laws, and that you could live in a corrupt regime where those laws are terrible, and you would be doing the right thing by disobeying those laws. But he's talking about the ideal. And the word that's translated as lawful is the word namimas. And namimas doesn't mean lawful in the sense of someone who abides by legal applications. Rather, it is talking about the person who is doing the thing that is fitting and therefore should be a law. So he's talking not just about the citizen, but he's also talking about the lawmaker. The lawmaker should make laws that are namimas, and those laws are ones that are naturally fitting to the human condition and are also socially fitting to the group of people and their conditions that they're in. And so, therefore, the namimas person is the person who does the things that the political association is meant to do. And that is, as we saw, political science is the science of human happiness. It's the science of making society a happier society and therefore leading to the general advantage. And what is that happiness? Well, Aristotle spent the first book telling us that happiness is virtue. It's the activity in accordance with virtue. And so therefore the namimas action is that which leads to the general happiness or general virtue. Therefore, it follows that what he means by the nomimos person, the person who is lawful, is both the statesman person who creates laws that are going to lead to virtue of the citizens, and the citizen who abides by those laws, and therefore by abiding by those laws is contributing to the virtue of his or her neighbors. So this is really important, because this is very different than the modern idea of justice, of legal justice, as just respecting the rights of others. Indeed, you might say that we might think a person is just in this sense as long as he doesn't violate anybody else's rights, whereas Aristotle says, but what if you are a bad influence on others? What if your actions do not educate others toward virtue, but are bad examples? What if your speech is such that it leads people to do vicious things? Then that in itself would make you an unlawful person, even if you, strictly speaking, didn't disobey any laws. And so the laws of the state not only should be protecting people's rights. For Aristotle, good laws are laws that fit and are conducive toward the happiness of humans in general, and specifically to the society which you're in, which may be different. So, being fair is not necessarily being lawful, but being lawful is always being fair. What does that mean? Well, think about it like this. Again, universal justice is about the whole. It's virtue in general, he might say. It's when I am virtuous, not just in myself, but toward the whole. And thus it is that which leads to virtue in general for others. But fairness is just my particular actions and the way I deal with other people. And so there might be things that are lawful, but aren't necessarily, there might be things that are fair that aren't necessarily lawful, and that the law would make unlawful. In what way? Well, think about driving on a certain side of the road. We have that law because it leads to the general good. If people drove on different sides of the road, depending on how they felt, then that would lead to general chaos and destruction of life, and therefore it would lead to unhappiness. So we need to make a law, right? When we in the United States say, okay, everyone has to drive on the right side of the road. Well, what does that mean? That means that we take something that isn't necessarily unfair, right? Oh, I drive on the right side of the left side of the road, so therefore I'm an unfair or unjust person. No, that's not the case. We know that. But we set this law and therefore make unlawful that which isn't necessarily unfair. So, therefore, what is lawful is always fair. And thus, again, we have a very important thing in Aristotle. What Aristotle is saying is, therefore, no laws should take advantage of people. If it takes advantage of people, it shouldn't be lawful. It's not just. And so he's not the kind of person that says the ends justify the means, that I can create a certain law that leads to the general virtue, even if it takes advantage of this particular person. He would say that's always wrong. And so his notion of justice isn't utilitarian. It's not pragmatic. It's not, let's make a law that takes advantage of certain people for a certain amount of time so that in general everyone's rights are respected or their virtue is increased. He says if it hurts the individual, it hurts the whole. And so no law can be unfair if it's to be lawful. So now what we want to do in our next lecture is talk about the particular virtue of justice. This is virtue in general as it relates to others. But this is the particular character trait that is justice and is this idea of how as individuals, both leaders and followers, we are fair. And we're going to talk about what that consists of.